Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. In this video we have some scary horror stories for you. People that were abducted by aliens and had run-in with ghosts. It was the early summer of 2010. I only remember it because it was my 21st birthday, and I was finally legal to drink. It was a Friday night, and I was drinking at a bar, where my cousin David worked as a bartender. Outside of an event, such as a band or other entertainment, it was a small town bar. It was usually fairly quiet. It was very early in the evening, and I had just finished my shift at McDonald's in another small town less than 10 miles away from where I lived. I was only on my second drink of the evening when my phone rang. On the other end of the line was James, a childhood friend of mine. He was calling, asking if I wanted to come over to his brother's house for a night of poker, smoking, and drinking. And, despite the fact that I was only one sip into my second gin and tonic, I agreed to drive into Toledo. Most people are familiar with Toledo, but for those who aren't, it's a city in northwest Ohio, about an hour south of Detroit. It was only about a 20-minute drive from my small town, so I figured it would be a good time to go. I came home to get some cash. I only ever took about $10 to $20 to the bar to ensure that if I got caught up in having a good time drinking, I had enough money. I didn't overdo it and end up closing down the bar that evening. I left my house at 11:05 p.m. I recall calling James to let him know I was on my way because they were going to wait for me and start the poker game at 11:30. We always played a tournament-style poker game in which we all put our money in at the same time, received equal amounts of chips, and played until only one person remained with any chips, who then got to keep all of the money. As I had done so many times before, I took my usual route over to my brother Eddie's house. We had formed a group of 4 to 6 people and were playing poker in Eddie's basement at least twice a month. I'd just arrived at the intersection of Oakdale Street and East Broadway. I was sitting at a red light in an area that was nothing but residential housing outside of the elementary school that sat at that exact corner, sitting up looking at the red light, which always seemed to take an eternity coming from this direction. When I noticed something in the sky that was partially hidden directly behind the red light from my vantage point. It was a very bright white light that seemed to be pointing straight down, almost like a helicopter using a spotlight to identify something, but much, much brighter the point of origin. After rolling down my windows, I realized this couldn't possibly be a helicopter because I'd be able to hear it. Wanting a better vantage point, I pulled into the parking lot of an ice cream shop across the street from the school. I was nearby and got out of my car to see what this thing was. When I got out of the car, I looked up into the sky and saw it again. It couldn't have been a plane because it was the wrong shape. It was more oval than round. Most stories about it are circular, but it was definitely an oval shape. Given the shape, I almost assumed it was a blimp, but it seemed far too large to be a blimp, even by the measurements of some well-known blimps, such as the Goodyear blimp, and it lacked any decals or identifying marks, either silveryish or grayish. After what felt like 30 seconds of staring at this thing, my eyes began to burn, not in the sense of extreme burning or anything, but almost like when a bug flies into your eyes and causes them to water. I close my eyes and start rubbing them. My eyes are closed at this point, so all I can see is black. After finally getting my eyes to stop bothering me, I tried to look up again, only to find it had vanished. I looked everywhere but couldn't find it. This is a densely populated neighborhood with houses, trees, and other structures that can obscure any view of what you'd look up into the sky to see. After about a minute, I decided it was time to go play poker. I walk over to Eddie's house, which is about 4 blocks away from the incident, and knock on the basement door. After a few moments, no one responds. I went to the front door and knocked, thinking that since I was probably 5 or 10 minutes early, they might be upstairs on the PlayStation. I knocked on the door but received no response. Finally, I begin knocking very loudly, almost pounding on the door. Eddie eventually answers the door, saying, "Man, why are you knocking on my door this late?" I looked at him, perplexed, and said, "Well, your brother said to come over and play cards with you guys." He stares at me for what seemed like an eternity before responding. "Yeah, I know he did, man. He called you about 5 or 6 hours ago, man. It's 4:30 a.m. How late did you expect us to play?" This frightened me a little. According to what I recall at the time, it couldn't possibly be later than 11 p.m. I tried to play it off, saying that I must have lost track of time. "Can I use your restroom before I return home?" He agrees and suggests that I splash some water on my face because I appear to be either drunk or haven't slept in a week. When I walked into his bathroom, my eyes were completely bloodshot, and I still have 2 black eyes to this day. That night, I have no idea what happened to me. I have no explanation for the hours of wasted time. I'm not sure how I could have missed that much time passing, or how on earth something that felt like a mosquito or something similar flying into my eyes could have caused it, and I'm not sure I want to pretend to know what it was and explain it, or even assume that whatever I saw that evening had anything to do with it. But it has always bothered me. I would tell my parents about God from the time I could speak. I was obsessed with him, and would tell everyone about him. I'd talk to him and play with him. My parents assumed it was just a fantasy. They're common among children, and because I'm the youngest of 4 boys, they assumed my brothers didn't want to hang out with the little kids. So I made my own pal. When I was 2 or 3 years old, my mother would find me sitting alone in my room, having conversations with thin air and responding as if someone had said something, nodding, listening, and laughing as if he told a joke. I treated God as if he were a real person, and I still genuinely believe he is a part of me. I would demand God have his own seat in his own plate of food every single day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and any time we left the house I'd scream and cry if they forgot in the house. He'd have to have his own seat. He ended up having his entire toddler car seat because I was so afraid of him getting hurt. And I have memories of God, generally seeing DOD with my own eyes, and I'd swear on my life that he was still there to this day. He was about a foot or so tall, the size of a small child like me, but he was a pure white, mostly featureless bipedal bear. He had no face. He had an outward bump where a muzzle would be in 2 indents where he should have had eyes. He had no face, he had an. He wore no clothes and had no real paws or hands. He resembled a gummy bear, with round tapered hands and feet and no distinguishing features. He was, however, solid white and not transparent. He didn't say anything. It was more like I knew exactly what he was saying. I also don't recall him walking anywhere or moving at all. But every time I looked away and then back, he was in a different place. I swear on my life, on everything. I know he was real in some ways. I don't remember how old I was. I'd guess around 4 or 5. I followed DOD outside because he wanted to show me something. He took me around the back of the house to a square panel I'd never seen before. It looked like a tiny door with a simple hook latch. When I opened it, there was a concrete floor, a really low ceiling, and a dusty old red tricycle inside. You're probably picturing the typical little one. It was filthy, and I couldn't see anything except a speck of concrete, and the tricycle because the sun was directly overhead. I climbed into the little cubbyhole and sat with my knees to my chest, and I can still see DOD standing just outside the door, facing me. I had no idea this location existed. who tells their toddler about a spooky concrete hole in the back of the house. That is the only way in from the outside. I recently told my parents about that memory a few months ago, and they said they purposely didn't tell me or my brothers about it because the concrete drops off about 2 feet into open pipes, wires, and insulation. And because there is no access from the inside, it would be extremely difficult to find us if one of us fell in. For 6 years, I didn't forget about my father. I never missed one of his meals. I've never ignored him for an entire day. For 6 years, I never let us go on a car ride without him, but we had to move. I'd been living in the same house my entire life, and today was the last day we'd ever be there before moving on to the new house. My mother picked me up and put me in the car before turning around to pick up God and bring him to where she was. I burst out crying and angrily stated that Dodds was not coming. I apparently stopped talking about God that day, and for years I was extremely upset and angry if anyone mentioned him in my presence. My mother informed me that she had researched the house we had lived in and discovered that there had been a little boy years before us who had died when a gas pipe bursted directly in his face. And as terrifying and strange as that sounds for my faceless friend, I'm not sure if I believe it. I've never been afraid of God and no longer consider him to be frightening. I find it extremely strange, especially given that he appeared as a featureless bear and stayed with me for 6 years, which is much longer than most imaginary friends. It's mind-boggling to me that he took me to a part of the house I'd never been to before, and that the knowledge of it was deliberately kept from me. Sure, it could be some bizarre psychological phenomenon, or it could be some strange type of ghost or spirit. But, in any case, I believe in and continue to think kindly of God, and I'm grateful to have had a strange childhood friend. The story I'm about to tell you took place in my country during the summer of 2012. In Portugal at the time, I lived in the north with my parents and brother, and in the south with an extended family from my mother's side, including my grandparents, uncle, and 3 cousins, 2 girls and a boy who was 17 at the time and 5 years older than me. This cousin will be referred to as George. George was a typical adolescent. He was outgoing, participated in sports, was a talkative person, a good student, and got along well with me and my family. During the summer, we went to my grandparents' house in the south to visit our relatives who lived there. When possible, everything was normal at first. My uncle and cousins came to see us, and would usually have lunch with us, spend the afternoon at the house, and then have dinner. George was his usual self for the first week or 2, being very talkative, playing cards and playing video games with me and my brother, and going for walks with us. At some point during the summer, George went on a trip to a city in the English countryside to meet a couple of friends, 2 sisters around his age who lived there with their parents and whom he had met in Portugal when they were there on vacation. His stay was supposed to last a couple of weeks. However, something happened at the end of the first week when my uncle received a phone call from the girls' parents. They were asking my uncle to come meet them as soon as possible and pick up my cousin because he wasn't feeling well and was acting strangely, leading them to believe that he wasn't mentally capable of returning on his own. As a result, my uncle needed to go there. So my uncle went to England the next day and returned George right away. When my family and I met George again, we were taken aback. He wasn't the same person who had left only a week before and whom we had known our entire lives. The fight wasn't physical, it was psychological. I'm not referring to a typical adolescent mood swing. If I had to describe his behavior in one word, it would be upsetting, but an understatement would be apathetic. George didn't say anything, didn't move, and didn't show any emotion in his eyes. When we tried to talk to him, the only sign of life he gave was an occasional groan. He was clearly in need of medical attention. The days that followed his return were filled with hospital visits. My uncle took him to see a psychologist, who proved ineffective. He then took him to neurologists and psychiatrists, who were also perplexed by his condition. George had his blood sampled because his behavior could have been explained by being drugged while in England, but the results were normal. Despite this, he was prescribed a number of medications. The first week had passed with no signs of conflict. More pills, more appointments, more blood tests, and the same results the following week. George's days continued to consist of him sitting in a chair, not talking to anyone, moaning and occasionally crying softly. My family is Christian, and my grandmother was especially devout. She began to suspect that his behavior could not be explained by science and was not the result of a hormonal change or a hidden neurological disease. And, to be honest, I was disappointed because I knew that wasn't my cousin. I know it sounds ridiculous, but when all the scientific explanations and treatments failed, we began to believe he was in a possession situation, even though he wasn't speaking in different languages, crawling on the walls, spinning his head, or levitating like in certain movies. However, it was very telling. So, on the third week since George's return, my grandmother was able to obtain holy water from the priests of our local village on the same day. When I was in the living room with my cousin in the afternoon, I saw my grandmother come in with the holy water and position herself behind him while he was sitting in his chair. She began sprinkling him with the holy water and silently praying to no opposition from him. Just his now standard soft groans. My 12-year-old self was quietly watching this, knowing what this ritual was about and hoping it worked. My grandmother was finished in about 10 minutes. Peter exhibited no discernible change. Later that afternoon, my brother joined us in the living room, and a couple of other family members put a chessboard on the table and asked if anyone wanted to play chess with him. I can participate. We were taken aback. It was one of our cousins. He stood up and went to play with my younger brother. It was a breathtaking sight that we couldn't believe. He was not only speaking, but also interacting with someone. After nearly a month, George returned to his older self in a matter of days or weeks. Since that time, no one ever talked to him about it, and I still don't know if he was aware of his condition and what my grandmother did to him, but I don't think I'll ever ask. Every now and then. What happened that summer of 2012 still haunts me. It definitely changed my perspective on certain things, mostly on a spiritual level, and made me believe that there are many things that are simply beyond our comprehension. This happened to me around the age of 11. It was the early 1990s. I had spent my entire life in El Paso, Texas. Folklore and religious beliefs abound in the culture. Many Hispanic families have paranormal stories. One popular legend is that of the weeping woman Aquia La Llorona. Since the days of the conquistadors, the legend of La Your owner Spanish for the weeping woman had been a part of Hispanic culture in the Southwest. The tall, thin spirit is said to have natural beauty, and long flowing black hair while dressed in a white gown. She roams the rivers and creeks, wailing into the night and looking for children to drag screaming to their deaths in the water. Nobody knows when the legend of La Llorona began or where it came from. The specifics differ depending on the source. The one thing they all have in common is that she is the spirit of a drowned mother who now spends eternity searching for her children in rivers and lakes. One night, like any other, I slept in a trailer with my mother and father. My youngest brother was visiting my aunt. As usual, I fell asleep watching Jay Leno. And when I awoke, I was sitting on the couch in my living room. The time was 4 a.m., and the kitchen stove was lit up. The television was turned off, and I usually had a light on. But this time it was completely dark. I awoke to the sound of a horrible scream coming from a long distance away. The screams were coming from a ditch a few feet away from my house. I thought I was hearing things when I heard it. I wondered if I was dreaming. Then I heard the animals outside howling and whimpering, these animals being our cats and dogs. The animals continued to scream as the screaming got closer. The screaming was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It sounded like I was in a long corridor with a woman screaming her guts out. Then, amid the screams, I began to make out words. Those words were uttered by whoever it was at 4 a.m., screaming their guts out. The woman was screaming in Spanish, "My children." I jumped up from the sofa, dashed to the kitchen, which was right next to where I was sleeping. I turned on the nearest light, and took a look around. The screams never stopped. In fact, the screams grew louder and closer. I questioned my sanity at the time, wondering if I was crazy or hearing things. Then I realized, this is real, and the animals are reacting negatively to it. So I did what any other 11-year-old boy would do in this situation. I dashed into my parents' room. I reached for my mother and violently shook her awake. She slowly awoke, much to my surprise. As she awoke, the screaming subsided. I began to wonder, what the hell is going on? Then I asked my mother, "Do you hear that screaming, crying lady?" "Go back to sleep," my mother said, half asleep. "It's all in your head." "No," I told her, "this is real." "Do you hear what I'm saying?" My mother quickly said, "You're dreaming, go back to sleep, everything will be fine." By then, the screaming had faded far away. As if whoever was yelling was aware that an adult was awake. I returned to the living room, terrified, and quickly turned on the television while leaving most of the lights on. I didn't sleep again until the sun came up. I couldn't believe what I was hearing and seeing. I was treated as if I were insane. When I told my story, it got so bad that I kept it to myself until today. I'm not concerned with what others think of my experience. I know I heard what I heard, and it happened to me again a few years later. This story takes place after the first encounter with La Llorona. Not much happened after the first time I heard her, except for an incident with my aunt about a year later. According to my aunt, they were sleeping when they heard a terrible sound coming from the ditch in front of their house. There is a street between the ditch and the house, but her house and the ditch are very close. It was approximately 2:30 a.m. My aunt was awakened by the screams of a woman coming from the ditch. She reasoned that someone had been hurt or was being attacked. She walked out to the front yard, looking towards the ditch, and seeing that there was no woman, my cousin, her daughter, also walked out and asked her what was going on. Of course, my aunt had no idea. They noticed her as the screaming got closer. A lady in a white gown. The only thing that bothered them was that the woman had no feet, and appeared to be floating. Another thing that threw them off was the woman's lack of a face. When they saw that, they both turned and ran inside their house. My aunt locked the door and dialed 911. Minutes later, the police arrived and took their claims seriously. El Paso police were quickly dispatched to the scene where this woman was seen and heard screaming. The police quickly returned and stated that there was no evidence of a woman's presence. They searched the area where the woman had been seen walking and found no trace of her. One of the officers even wondered if my aunt was dreaming. Everything that happened the next day happened when I went over to see my cousin for the first time. She had black bags under her eyes from not sleeping since the incident. I asked her what happened, and she said she saw the screaming woman with no feet and no face that my aunt saw. It took some time for her to sleep normally again. La Llorona was never mentioned or seen again. But, to this day, she refuses to deny having witnessed something she couldn't explain. Unlike my cousin, I did not have the good fortune to avoid La Llorona. It was in the early 2000s that I worked at Big 8, a local supermarket in El Paso, Texas. One of my shifts ran from 3 a.m. to 12 p.m. The store was located in El Paso's Lower Valley. One early morning, around 4 a.m., a small ditch in the back of the store. I had the back doors open and was carrying the empty milk crates outside. At the time of the incident, I was working with two other guys. We thought it would be funny to close the back doors and lock me outside as a joke, so we named one of the guys. I knew he was just messing around when I heard the doors close. I told myself that I'd just stay quiet and wait for him to reopen the doors. I wasn't going to fall for his joke or let him scare me. I stood by the door, smiling to myself, thinking, he's not going to scare me. On the other side of the door, I could hear us laughing. I thought to myself, well, the joke's on him because I'm not scared. About 1 minute later, I heard screaming in the distance, just a guttural screech. And I realized it was the same screaming I had heard when I was 11 years old. Screaming became louder and closer to me. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if I were being watched by an unseen force. I was filled with despair. It was an experience unlike any other. I began pounding on the door. I begged him to let me in. Someone is out there. I pounded my fists on the door and began kicking it, pleading with him to let me in. On the other side of the door, I could still hear them laughing. I began kicking the door harder. The screams were now coming from directly behind me. Just as I opened the door and asked, "What is that?" I dashed inside and locked the warehouse door. Were you wondering why that lady was screaming? Did she require assistance? That's what I told him. That wasn't a lady, in my opinion. I told him about something that had happened to me when I was younger. Are you sure you don't think you're cursed, Jay, or that she's following you? I remained silent when he told me that I wouldn't be able to work my normal shift after that, and it took me a few hours to recover. What occurred? I admit I was scared, and maybe we were correct. What if she was watching me? After that, in 2015, there was another incident. I began working as a custodian at Cedar Grove Elementary School. The border highway is located behind the school. Then there's the Rio Grande, which is surrounded by a massive metal fence that separates Mexico from El Paso. From 2:30 p.m. to 11 p.m., I worked the night shift. I was stuck working with another custodian until midnight one night. Right? We did a walkthrough of the school before leaving to ensure that all the doors were locked from the outside. I collaborated with another custodian, see? He never believed in ghosts, she always said. Until that fateful night. We walked to our cars, and as I was about to leave, I noticed C had opened the hood of his car. Then he said, "Hey Jay, can you give me a jump? My car's battery has died." "Yes, of course," I replied. A loud scream came from the Rio Grande as I stepped out of my car. All of the animals in the surrounding neighborhood began howling and crying once more, the screams resembling a woman screaming her guts out in the hallway as it echoed all over. When she looked at me, she exclaimed, "My God, is that a demon?" "No," I told him. "That's your owner, as you can see." He looked me in the eyes and said, "No way, she can't be real." Then I mentioned that I'd heard it before. Then she said, "Please hurry, let's get out of here." I jumped him, and then we saw a border patrol jeep speeding towards the screaming woman. And then it occurred to me that I could record this and share it with the rest of the world. I took out my phone, and as soon as I hit record, the screaming stopped. See? And we exchanged glances, and he exclaimed, "What in the world? Sorry, but I have to leave before that evil witch comes back to get us." We both walked away. The next day, C was telling everyone at work about how we heard the witch crying the night before. That was the last time I saw her. I don't believe it's the last, as she may choose who hears or sees her. I have more supernatural stories. As a member of a group in El Paso, Texas, we've visited a number of historical sites. I also had the opportunity to conduct research with Amy Bruni and other celebrities who have visited El Paso. This is a different story for another day. But thank you for listening, and I hope to post more stories about La Llorona in the future. In my entire 24-year life, definitely, I have never been on a train roller coaster. But a real train. No way, since I was a kid and my grandmother and mother would take me to Six Flags in St. Louis during the summers. I was beyond excited by the time I arrived because of the sleepless night, tossing and turning from pure excitement of what I had to do the next day, but I always did what every kid between the ages of 7 and 12 does. I had a great time at the park and promptly fell asleep in the back seat of the truck when we left, not waking up until we pulled into the driveway. I was never afraid of roller coasters, even those with loops. I was always the one who led whoever was with us down the long path of the line you'd go to get up to the ride one by one, coaster after coaster. I always knew that by the middle of our visit, I'd be too scared for a certain ride that I still avoid to this day. I've never had the guts to ride the freaking train that circles the park. That's correct. The choo-choo train. I can't think of a single reason or even possibility as to why I'm so afraid of trains now. Let's fast forward about a decade to the age of 20. I live in a small town in southeast Missouri, and my mom lives right next door. When I get bored, I go next door and watch TV with her and my baby sister. She has also finally accepted the fact that I smoke quite frequently, and when my sister is visiting my grandparents across town, I'll sometimes come share a blunt with my mom, but this time it was all three of us. I'm laying on the couch, my sister is at her princess table in the corner P. She just made something for us. She takes a seat, and I had it on that show I Shouldn't Be Alive. After she sat down for about 15 minutes, she said, "You know, this reminds me of what you told me when you were about 3 years old," thinking she was talking to my sister. I turned away from the television, and she was staring at me, I said. She continued by telling me that when I was 3 years old, I randomly started talking about my other family. Apparently from what she told me, my two sisters, my mom, aunt and our cat, we're all headed somewhere and we all died in a train crash. At first I was laughing hysterically, "That's hilarious," thinking that maybe she was messing with me, but then she swore to God that I randomly said that when I was about 3 years old. In that moment something made sense that I've never been able to find reasoning for my F. Can someone please assist me with this? Could she possibly be serious? I'll be 25 this year and I still think about this a lot, and I have no explanation for anything. My living room door handle would rattle every night, but because it was next to the front door, I put it down when I moved into my house in 1985 after the birth of my second daughter. Drafts? My husband was home one night, and I was wide awake trying to fall asleep when I saw a monk enter my room, circle it, and exit through a wall. I was shaking my husband awake, shouting, "Look, look, there's a monk." But he was too late and said I was dreaming. 6 weeks later, I'm at home with just my 2 children, and I go to bed, and the monk appears again, reading me the last rites, or so I thought. I yelled that I'm not a Catholic, and he vanished. My eldest daughter then told me one day, "I like that old lady." I asked her which old lady she was referring to, and she responded, "The elderly lady, who comes into my room every night to read to me." My husband told me she was just dreaming, and we left it at that until I heard her speak quietly. One night, she sat up in bed, eyes wide open, holding out her arm as if holding someone's hand, and looked directly at someone. When I asked what she was doing, she simply put her arm back down, laid back down, and fell asleep. Yeah, she's dreaming, I thought. I asked her to describe the old lady when she mentioned her again. She described herself as having grey hair and round glasses. Anyway, we never really discussed it again, and I knew that if there was a problem, my daughter would tell me 3 years later that I had my son. So I relocated my daughters to another bedroom that I previously used as a junk room and which always gives me the creeps. I once heard a woman in there laughing hysterically, and when I opened the door, there was no one there, but the rocking chair was rocking by itself. I just shut the door and thought, fine, whoever it is having a good time. Then the real action began. My youngest daughter would tell me about a man who would prevent her from entering my room at night and force her to return to bed. She swears to this day, more than 30 years later. Then one night, I heard my youngest daughter repeatedly yelling for me. So I dashed upstairs to enter a room and came to a halt. My daughter has gotten out of bed and is playing tug of war with her quilt. The quilt is in the air, with nothing holding it up on one side, and it's being dragged by my daughter and whatever else is holding it on the other end. I think I was in disbelief and saying things like, "What on earth is going on?" My daughter claims that he's refusing to give me my quilt at this time. I realize I'm not delusory, and neither is my daughter.